Hey, what is up, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going through a brief history of the Atari Lynx and its innovations and its eventual downfall, and what it kind of meant for the downfall of Atari during the time. It was released initially on September 1st, 1989, following the release of the Game Boy, and it was the first handheld console that was backlit and had a color screen. It also featured a 17 unit multiplayer system, and even though most games would only work with 8 or fewer, because most games at the time had no reason to have 17 players at the same time. It sold 1 to 3 million units. That's an estimation, but that is questioned slightly because of the history of the discontinuation of the Lynx. It did have two revisions, with the second revision being slightly smaller, more compact. That was released in 1991. It was released in between the Nintendo Game Boy and the Sega Game Gear, which kind of left it as the unwanted middle child of the handheld consoles, with it being more expensive than the Game Boy. And then when the Game Gear was released with the same features, essentially with backlighting and color, it was still more expensive than the Game Gear, and the price didn't allow the Lynx to get away with the drawbacks that it had, like the Game Gear had. Some of the drawbacks were, obviously, it took six AA batteries and it only gave you a battery life of about 3 hours. And at a launch price of 180 bucks, you're not going to be able to get away with that. So the Lynx sales numbers is called into question a little bit. I found this thread by Mr. Chris Thomas over on nerdly.com, and he calls into question the numbers because of the discontinuation of the Atari Lynx in 1990, throughout the early part of the 90s, as they gradually dropped support for it. And it essentially boils down to the Jaguar only selling an estimated 115,000 units. And if the Lynx sold 1 to 3 million, why would you discontinue the support for the system while your other system is tanking? If Atari viewed the Jaguar as their last chance to save themselves, why wouldn't they continue the support for the Lynx because it was selling more? Why wouldn't you just keep that going as well? That is where the number of sales for the Lynx gets called into question a lot. Now, to put it into perspective of how bad of a flop this was. So the Atari Lynx was released in 89, fully discontinued by 95. They stopped selling them in 92 and 93. The original Game Boy that came out the same year was finally discontinued on March 23rd, 2003. Despite not evolve, obviously the Game Boy Color came out, the Advance and the Advance SP were already on the way by 2003. The original Game Boy itself lasted 14 years. And now to compare it to something that's a little bit more in the wheelhouse of the Lynx in terms of price, in terms of what it was, the Game Gear was discontinued. Even the Game Gear lasted way longer than the Lynx ever could have hoped for. I mean, the Game Gear even lasted until 97. So, what kind of why did the Lynx fail? And in my opinion, it comes down to a couple key factors. Obviously, the launch price. The original Game Boy had an original launch price of 90 bucks. The Lynx came out at 180. So you're now doubling the price of your competitor. Your competitor has a way better name in the console market. And then a year later, the Game Gear comes out. Regardless of if it had the same flaws as you or not, it's now $30 cheaper, with Sega also having a way better name in the console market. Atari was way on their way out by the early 90s, and throughout the 90s it just kept getting worse in terms of market share, in terms of consumer reputation. It just it, it wasn't working, and you kind of need, like, especially in the portable gaming market, obviously kids is a major thing. And also, you got to look at the parents. The parents obviously probably grew up with a 2600, but they seen your downfall. They are seeing your downfall in real time. The the 7800 didn't work, the 5200 didn't work. It it just it couldn't compete. They were inefficient. Atari was living way in the past. And although it was innovative with, like I mentioned, the 17 player multiplayer system, the just the fact that it was color and it was backlit, it was reversible. I think to this day is the only console to really do that efficiently, in terms of you could use it in, well, the standard way a controller works, with D-pad being on the left, buttons being on the right. You could flip it. You can use the D-pad on the right, the buttons on the left if you so choose. It just did not, it was, it was good, but the price didn't keep it competitive. The drawbacks didn't keep it competitive, and it was not what Atari needed at that time. If Atari had released a Game Boy similar model before Nintendo did, I feel like that could have saved them more than running with the Lynx and the Jaguar. It only had less than a 3 hour battery life. You're, I mean, even with modern day batteries, according to computerhistory.org, only had 6 hours of battery. You you're not going to get away with that, especially when you're failing as a company. It, I mean, obviously as mentioned by computerhistory.org, the Lynx was used in development for Chips Challenge, mega popular game for the Spectrum and the Amstrad, though. It wasn't for the Lynx console. It didn't, you didn't have a reason to pick the Lynx over a Game Gear or over a Game Boy. You had, and even with the revisions, the second revision, I believe, came out in 91 and had a reduced price of $100. So now you're undercutting the Game Gear, but you still don't have that brand recognition that you once did. You're still not undercutting the Game Boy. I mean, the Game Boy by 1991, the Game Boy was it was solidified in its place. It was solidified in its reputation. Nintendo was moving forward. They had the Super Nintendo out, make it popular. Same thing with Sega. They had the Game Gear and the Genesis. Obviously, Sega eventually went on to ruin the hype train that they had at the time with all their add-ons for the Genesis, but at the time of release and for the couple years after release, it did not work. It was a innovative system, but it wasn't what Atari needed at the time, and it wasn't what the consumers wanted. You can't double up the price of your competitor and expect to win unless you are absolutely hitting a home run with performance, with game selection, form factor. It just, obviously, I don't think anything could have beat the original Game Boy in sales. It's kind of one of those things that once it was put out, it just, you knew it was going to be a freight train. But you could have at least tried to compete with the Game Gear, and then Sega saw what you did and then undercut you. So obviously, obviously by 1995, according to SegaRetro.org, the Game Gear had 51% of the market share in the handheld market. You it just there was no place for the Lynx to go. There was no place for it to grow. There was no place for it to solidify its place in the marketplace. And eventually, Nintendo, like as mentioned here, Nintendo didn't really pass the specs and the features of the Game Gear until 2001, but that didn't matter because they were cheaper than everybody else and they had more games than everybody else. You don't really hear about the Lynx because of these two consoles. And as much as I think the Lynx was a cool idea and it was a super innovative for its time, it just wouldn't have worked. Dice fall a different way. Maybe the Lynx comes out before the Game Gear. Maybe it can really get in and dig into the market, but Nintendo had the jump on everybody in terms of handheld gaming, in terms of price to performance games, and then Sega comes in with pretty much not the same console, but pretty much comes in with a similar console, being it was backlit, being it had color, and then undercuts you by $30. You're not going to win. This was another failure in the long failure that was Atari. And as mentioned here, they discontinued it in 92 so they could concentrate on the Jaguar. And with the Jaguar only selling 115,000, the I would say the Jaguar was the nail in the coffin for Atari, but this definitely dug the hole and built the coffin. May not have shut the lid, but this set them up for what the Jaguar was going to do. And then by that time the Jaguar had come out. Jaguar comes out in 93, PlayStation comes out very soon after, Nintendo 64 comes out very soon after. And it was over. They had lost. So this is going to be a new series on the channel where we kind of do a deep dive into ill-fated handhelds. And if you know of any handhelds you would like to see me kind of go do a retrospective on, please leave them in the comments below. Don't be afraid to like and subscribe, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.